So this is Zach Carson. This may be very familiar to some of you, maybe very unfamiliar to others of you, but if you've been around our church for long, then you know Zach and you probably know him pretty well. He grew up here and then spent about 4 years in college and then came back after that and was part of something we'd never done before. Him and Zach McCartney both, part of our Leadership Academy, and they spent over a year here training with us, working with our ministry staff day to day, being in all the meetings, learning what it means to live day to day in ministry and serving a church, and what it means to be in a church serving in ministry. And that was a joy to get to see that. Listen, Zach knew me when I was a lot younger, and I knew him when he was a lot younger, and he knows a lot more about me than I probably wish he knows, and I've got lots of stories on him that I can tell you anytime, and glad to do that. But it's been awesome to see God working in his life and what God's done now. And so Zach is here to speak to us for the next 4 weeks, and is going to share some words with us. And so I wanted to just kind of catch everybody up on where you are, what you've been doing, what you're doing now as well. So you ended some time in California in May, so tell us a little bit about that.
That's right, yeah. My wife Abigail and I have been living in California for 3 years. We were both at school there in Pepperdine. I was in law school and she was in business school. We both graduated this summer. We moved back in August. We're here to stay forever. That's been made clear to me by my parents and her parents. We're here to stay forever, so it was a great time out there. We missed the weather, but they don't know how to do barbecue, so it's good to be back.
Okay, and you are actually living in Texas, but you're not living in College Station right now.
Right.
A town about an hour and a half west of here. Starts with A, ends with Austin, or ends with Austin. And so with that, tell us a little bit about what you're doing there and what that is, this step of your life.
Yeah, I've never been hissed at. I apologize for where I live. I'm working there at the Supreme Court of Texas. I'm a clerk there for one of the justices. So that's what we're doing right now.
Awesome, that's great. And if you don't know, 2 days ago, Zach got his results that he passed the bar exam. And so congratulations on that. So listen, I was thinking, so Zach has spent lots of time in full-time ministry. He also now has his law degree and is able to practice law. So if you need to know about Jesus, Zach can help you out. If you have met Jesus but have troubles of your life from before you met Jesus, Zach can also help you out. So good things from that in both ways. So very thankful. So Zach is with us today and for the next 3 weeks as well. I'm so excited and glad for you to get to be a part of this. Thank you for your words and for your time coming and loving our church and taking the time to drive over every weekend for the next 3 weekends plus this one for you and Abigail both. So we're so grateful. So preach to us.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. The first time I was ever on this stage, some of you were here, it was in 2010. You probably remember, I was the nervous kid that got up and I read a slam poem that I wrote for LTC. And if that doesn't mean anything to you, that's okay. If you know, you know. LTC. That was 10 years ago, and I was holding my papers while I was trying to read this, and I was shaking so much, I had to set them down. It was making an audible noise, the paper shaking. And so you'll notice I still don't risk it. I don't hold paper on stage. But that was 10 years ago, and looking out now, I can see so many people who have been such a big part of my life and helped me out. And so Monty said, that the church was grateful for me to come, but honestly, the honor is mine. I'm so glad to be here. And just listening for the last 4 weeks to the stories coming out of this church that God has been doing for the last century and what he's doing right now. And it's incredible to be on board. I'm just so grateful to be here and help however I can. So today, we'll be in Matthew chapter 14. It'll be up on the screen, but if you have your Bible, Matthew chapter 14. I think this is the perfect text for us going into the next century at the A&M Church of Christ. So if you haven't been here, what I'm talking about is this church just celebrated 100 years of God's mercy and provision for this family at the A&M Church of Christ. So this Sunday, we're starting the 101st year. We're going into century number 2, and we have no doubt that God's going to keep doing what he's been doing. But as we take that step, I think this is the right story for us. Matthew 14, we're going to start in verse 22. Immediately, now pay attention, that word's going to come into play later. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. That's where they are right now. While he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You have little faith," he said. "Why did you doubt?" And when they climbed back into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now, I want to go back to verse 25 as we start, which is where Peter's response to Jesus. He says, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to get out of the boat and come to you." Now, I highlighted in that text what I think is the key to this story. There's a lot of things you could take from the story, but the key to this story, Peter saying, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." Now, you've probably heard this story before, but don't let the familiarity of the story rob it of its strangeness. Look at what Peter says, and really just think about this for a minute. "Lord, if it's you, if that's you, this guy standing out there on the water, tell me to come to you." There are a lot of ways I can think of to verify whether this person is Jesus beyond me getting out of the boat, right? Come a little closer so we can look at you. They all know what he looks like. Hey, how about this? Jesus, if it's really you, switch the direction of the wind so we can quit rowing and get to the other side. That would verify it was him. Peter said, or if it's you, come here and get in the boat. What are you doing out there on the water? But Peter says, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. That's a risky thing to ask. Because he might say, no, don't come to me. And then it's like, okay, I don't have enough faith to try and do it. But he might say yes, and then you have to try it. You have to get out of the boat and go to him. So this is a strange request, but I really think it's the key to this entire story, to a very strange story. To understand why Peter said this, we need to understand two things. There's two things we need to see. First, what happened earlier on this same day, right? Remember the text said it was evening? What happened earlier this same day is key to this story, and we'll get to that in a minute. The second thing we need to understand is the word if. I've put the definition here in case you're unfamiliar. If, it's a conjunction. In the event that, allowing that, or on the assumption that. If is a conditional conjunction, and it's also my favorite word in the English language. I love the word if, and I'll tell you why. My second favorite word in the English language, by the way, is yaldov. I don't know if you've heard that before. It stands for you all would have. It has 3 apostrophes. If y'all have known it was going to rain, y'all have brought your umbrellas. Yaldov, try it out. But my favorite word in English is if. If is my favorite word, and here's why. When somebody says the word if, as soon as you see that word, it activates your imagination. There's no way to engage with the word if without engaging your imagination. When someone says if, it creates an entire world, just like that, as fast as those 2 letters. When the word if appears, it drops a fork in the road of reality. Okay, that's why I put this road sign up there demonstrating. The fork, okay, in the road of reality. On one side of the fork, you've got a condition that's satisfied. On the other side, you've got that the condition is not. Here's an example for you. If we go to Rosa's today for lunch after church, I'm going to order the chicken tacos. Now, this hasn't happened yet. It's a thin hypothetical. We always go to Rosa's, but bear with me. If we were to go to Rosa's today, now, as soon as I say that, this image of me at Rosa's appears. It didn't exist until I said the word if. I'm there. I'm looking at all the tasty options on the menu, and I can picture myself choosing different things. Of course, I'm going to pick the chicken tacos, even though it's not Taco Tuesday. The word if created this hypothetical reality. Now, think about a more serious example. If I were to marry that person, as soon as you say it, there's this entire world that just springs into existence in your mind that you can then step into and think about the possibilities and step back out of. It didn't exist. You made it up, and then you can think about it. The word if is what lets you do that. If I were to take that job, if I were to ever see that old friend again that I haven't seen in so many years, you can play out these scenarios, right? And God gave us this word if to activate that ability he implanted in our brain called imagination. The reason I'm stressing this word is because over the next 4 weeks, starting today, we're going to look at this word if in terms of the person of Jesus. We're going to imagine if when it comes to Jesus. See, he is, in a lot of ways, the embodiment of what this word if means. Everybody he meets faces that crossroads. That sign you can see, the yellow sign, that's what it was like to meet Jesus. And everybody he meets, he forces them up against the if. If it's really him. If what he's saying happens to be true. If he's really God. And for us today, if he really rose from the dead and can save you from your sins. So the first thing we need to grasp about this story is the word if, because that's what came to Peter's mind when he saw Jesus standing on the water. Now we'll get back to that, but the second thing we need to understand, like I said, is what happened earlier this day, the background context. Now this is a story about miracles, okay, and about how miracles should affect us in our lives. Jesus never did pointless miracles, right? He never did parlor tricks, okay? He didn't just do miracles to impress people. He did miracles that had a purpose. He heals somebody, he drives out a demon, now that person is better off than they were before. He calms a storm, now we're not in danger from the storm. But this miracle is weird. He walks on water, and there's no immediate point like that. And so it makes me think there's something else going on here. This is a miracle for the miracle's sake. It's a miracle to teach us something about miracles. Okay, so I've got a list up here, some bullet points to help us walk through this really quick. Bear with me, okay? This is important to set up what happened that night on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus, in the story of Matthew, before chapter 14, he's done these 3 miracles you see on the left. He's healed the sick, he's driven out demons, and he's raised a girl from the dead in Matthew chapter 9. The disciples witnessed all of this. They've seen Jesus do these things. Now, in Matthew chapter 10, everything changes. The whole story of the gospel changes. Up until that point, only Jesus had ever done miracles. He'd done those 3 miracles you see on the left. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus splits up the disciples. He sends them out on their own to different places, and he gives them authority to do miracles. He says, go out, Matthew 10, verse 1, he sends them out. He gave them authority to drive out evil spirits, heal every disease and sickness. And he tells them this, as you go, preach this message. The kingdom of heaven is near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Now, Jesus is instructing the disciples and authorizing them to do all the miracles they've seen him do, right? They've watched him do these miracles. Now he tells them, go do the same miracles. Heal people, drive out demons, raise the dead, just like I did. Once they get back together with Jesus, after that, another thing happens. In chapter 14, the day of this story, Jesus has been teaching a crowd of 5,000 people, of at least 5,000 people. You all may be familiar with this story. It's getting dark. The people are hungry. The disciples say, Jesus, you got to send these people home. They're getting hungry. They need food. And then Jesus says something very strange. Matthew 14, verse 16. Okay, look back if you're following along here. 14, verse 16. Jesus tells the disciples, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. The only way you can read that sentence, the only reasonable way to look at what Jesus just said, you give them something to eat, is that he's asking them to perform a miracle. They don't have enough food. It's not like he thinks they might have the food hidden away somewhere. They don't have it. There's nowhere close by they can get it. And if there was, they couldn't afford it. We don't have enough food to feed at least 5,000 people, but Jesus still says, give them something to eat. He's asking them to do something impossible, which means he's asking them to do a miracle. But this one is different, as you can see on the list. They haven't seen him do it before. Nobody's ever done anything like this before. And he says, you give them something to eat. He's asking them to step beyond what they've seen, to take a step of faith and do something impossible. And they can't do it. The disciples who he's empowered to do all these miraculous things, they completely, in this situation, he makes a pass to them and they fumble the ball. They fumble it. Kind of like Alabama fumbled last night in the first half. I couldn't resist. Some of y'all saw that game. Man. The disciples have no idea what's going on here, okay? Jesus tells them, you give them something to eat. They say, hang on a minute, that's impossible. We can't do that. These are the guys who've been healing lepers with a touch. Say, well, that's impossible. We can't give them food. So Jesus steps in and he does it, okay? So take a look at the list here. They failed at multiplying food. Jesus steps in. He multiplies the food, okay? Are you following along with the miracle chart there? We're talking about miracles today. Remember, this is a story about miracles. Jesus empowered them to do something. And they fumbled. They couldn't do it. Now that brings us back to the first word of our text today. Remember I told you to pay attention? Immediately. Immediately, as soon as this happened, Jesus feeds the crowd. The disciples couldn't do it. And immediately after that, he says, listen, get in the boat. That word made that I underline, every other time that word is used in the New Testament, we translate it compelled or forced, right? Forcing somebody, right? It's used in Acts when the disciples get arrested. You get compelled. Jesus makes them get in the boat, right? There's no questions about it. He's got something on his mind. He's got a plan in this situation, right? You didn't learn what I wanted you to learn here. Get in the boat. We're going to try this again in a different way. He makes them get in the boat immediately after this story. Now, two of Jesus' most famous miracles, right? They happened on exactly the same day. This is why. The disciples are still second guessing. They're still doubting, okay? Let's come back around and let's take it from the top. Immediately, he made them get in the boat to go on ahead of them to the other side while he dismissed the crowd that he just miraculously fed. Now, fast forward to verse 25. They're out on the lake and Jesus comes towards them. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. You know, that's reasonable. If you see somebody walking on water, it's either Jesus or it's a ghost. And so for them, they had a reason to be afraid. They thought it was a ghost. That's scary. But the problem is they had just been with Jesus. He'd just been empowering them to do miracles. Earlier that day, they saw him multiply food out of thin air. And they see something on the water, and in their exhaustion, they've been rowing all night. They succumb to fear. They say, it's a ghost. Jesus immediately said to them, take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Now, this is a triple repetition. Jesus is saying exactly the same thing 3 times in a row. He says, don't give in to your fear because fear is going to blind you to the lesson I'm trying to teach. Fear will rob you of the miracles that you are capable of. Now he says, take courage, and he says, don't be afraid, which are very literal, but the most powerful synonym in this list of 3 things Jesus says is, it is I. Think about what that means. If it's a ghost like y'all thought, if it's a ghost on the water, you have every reason to be afraid. That's the rational response. Fear. It's a ghost, be afraid. But what if it's not? What if it's Jesus? What if it's really God made flesh? If it's the same person who's healed the sick, driven out demons, raised the dead, multiplied food, if it's really him, and Peter's imagination is activated. He has the same thought. What if it's not a ghost? What if it's him? And that's why he opens his mouth and says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. You know, the way Jesus and Peter met, the first time these 2 men ever interacted, it's recorded in Luke chapter 5. It was on the same lake. It was here on the Sea of Galilee, in a boat probably not too different from this one. It was in a fishing boat. Jesus introduced himself to Peter by performing a miracle. Some of you remember this story? Peter had been fishing all night, and it's embarrassing. He's a fisherman. He caught nothing. Jesus shows up, and he says, have you caught anything? No, thanks for pointing that out. And he says, throw your net on the other side. And he does, and he almost sinks his boat with how many fish he catches. And then Peter has a famous reaction to that miracle. He looks up at Jesus, who he's never met till now, and he says, depart from me. Go away from me. I'm a sinful man. And I think here on the lake, in the same lake, we're seeing a different Peter. He doesn't say, tell me to come to you, because he wants to verify whether it's Jesus. We've been over that. There's easier ways to do that. All of a sudden, here on this lake, through the wind, Peter's voice cuts through it back towards the solitary man who's standing out there on this water. And the same voice that reacted to Jesus' first miracle with, Lord, go away from me, now cries out and says, Lord, tell me to come to you. What changed for him? What changed is that Peter encountered the word if in the person of Jesus Christ. Peter is up against that fork in the road of reality where something incredible could be true, something in your imagination, you could step into it and embody it, and it could change the entire way you live your life. If is my favorite word because it creates worlds. And here, this timid little depart from me, I'm not worthy Peter, he speaks that word if, not to create a condition, but to acknowledge one that's standing right in front of him on the water. He's ready to make his choice. What changed? Years. Peter has seen Jesus. He's walked with him. He's traveled with him. He's spent time with him. Back when they first met, he didn't even know who Jesus was, but now they've traveled together. He's heard Jesus teaching. He's grown to love him. He's performed miracles on borrowed power, and now he's making his choice. I think what's running through his mind looks something like this. Let's flip back to the chart for just a second. There's a new miracle here that we can see. If we could get that up. Yeah, so Jesus, you see that on the left. Jesus is walking on water. Now, Peter, who failed earlier to multiply food, who failed at that request to do a miracle, sees his chance. right? He's had 12 hours rowing against the wind all night to relive that moment when Jesus said, you give them something to eat, but I can't. And then he watched Jesus do it. And he's sitting there, he's rowing, he's thinking, I totally blew it, I had a shot, and now Jesus is standing on the water. Jesus didn't invite him to come out. Peter invites himself. He says, I see you doing something, your miraculous power, and I want to be part of it, but only if it's you. And Jesus gives Peter the same answer in this situation that he'll give to you and me. He says, come. And Peter actually does it. This actually happened in this world that we're living in right now. He looks out at the figure of Jesus standing firm on the lake, and when he looks at him, his eyes, they quit seeing those massive waves barreling across the water around the boat. He listens to the fearless voice saying, come, and his ears, they quit hearing that screaming wind ripping across the water, and all of a sudden, he climbs over the side of the boat. His eyes, his ears, his heart, they were all fixated on one thing, Jesus Christ standing there in front of him, his faith stepping out, not against reason or what he knows to be scientifically true, but stepping beyond reason and what could possibly happen in this world. A faith that embraces the massive dimension of reality that our five senses cannot perceive. The inevitable if of Jesus Christ dropped a fork in the road for him, for the disciples, for you and for me. And in the end, choosing that right path requires a step of faith, not blind faith, an informed decision to trust somebody who has proven himself again and again. Jesus stands there right at the intersection of what we can't explain but can't deny and forces us to make a choice. And Peter says, Lord, if it's you, I know I can do anything, and what I want is to be close to you. And Jesus tells him what he'll tell you. Yes. I know this is true, personally, because this is what Jesus did for me. In a lot of ways, stepping up onto this stage right now, and stepping up on this stage 10 years ago when I awkwardly performed a slam poem for LTC, stepping up here is like stepping out onto the Sea of Galilee for me. A lot of you who have taught classes or who have preached before understand that feeling when you start to step up. It's a leap of faith. You start to get attacked. The voices of doubt in your own head telling you that you're not worthy. You know what? It goes through my mind every time. Who am I to stand up here and talk about God and the Bible to a lot of these people who raised me, who I know are way better at following Christ than I am, who've been doing it for way longer than I have? The first time this happened to me was the first time I preached a sermon. It was July 5th, 2015. I still remember. It was during the hardest time of my life. It was during the hardest summer of my life. In 2015, I was a junior in college, and that can be a lonely time. Everybody's trying to find themselves, so was I. I was losing in a fight against depression. I found it hard sometimes to get up in the morning or to be happy or to find joy in anything in my day-to-day life, and I felt terrible about it. What did I have to be sad for? And I wasn't sure about my calling in life. I felt called to ministry, but I didn't think that was right because I wasn't worthy to do ministry. I wasn't smart enough or good enough to do ministry. I was losing in a lot of fights that I was fighting in my life against sinful habits, against selfish behavior on a bunch of different fronts at the same time. I felt insecure. I felt dirty. I felt chained up by my secrets. And at that time, that summer, I was a preaching intern at a church full of incredible people who loved me. And none of them knew because I kept it a secret from them. Nobody knew what I was feeling. I got up there and I preached my first sermon. And I'm not kidding. As soon as I was done, I said the last thing I was going to say. I walked off the stage. I walked right out the back of the auditorium into a bathroom and I threw up. And I sat down on the floor. And I thought, God made a mistake. God was not going to use somebody like me to be a preacher or to do ministry. It was impossible. The first sermon that I ever preached, it was about Matthew 14. It was about this story. It was about Jesus and Peter walking on water, a story about miracles. It was a story when Jesus proved to his own terrified, exhausted disciples that they could do things that were impossible. I was desperate for a miracle that summer in my own life. And eventually God he showed up. He moved heaven and earth to free me from what I was going through. A lot of you were a part of that, whether you know it or not. But at that time, I needed a miracle. And unlike Peter, I didn't know how to ask for one. I was so blinded by Satan's lies, enslaved by secrets, a prisoner to pride. And I preached a sermon about Peter saying, Lord, if it's you, tell me to do something impossible. And then he did it. And as soon as I was done, I ran away in shame because I thought that the power of God had met its match when it came to my problems. But it came time to preach again the next week and the week after that. And since then, the time keeps coming, and Satan keeps playing his same old tricks. He keeps whispering the same old lies to me. And Jesus has showed up. He keeps doing for me the same thing he did for Peter and the same thing he'll do for you. He reminds me who he is. He reminds me what he's done for me. And he tells me not to be afraid. I stand up here and I admit all this without any fear at all. The failures in my past don't have any power over me because of what Jesus did. Jesus saved me from that. So when Satan starts telling me how unworthy I am, I agree, yeah, I'm completely unworthy, but through the power of God, I have been made worthy again. He came into my life and he saved me. He conquered the sin and the darkness in my heart. He's given me power and courage to love other people and to love myself when those are things that I thought could never happen. I have experienced miracles. I have a whole catalog of miracles in my life that I can flip through to remember who Jesus is. He reminds me again and again who he is. And I know that the friend who has been faithfully working miracles in my life for years isn't going to suddenly let me down tomorrow. He's taught me not how to step out of the boat on my own, but to say, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you. And every time he gives me the courage to take that step. Let's talk about your own Sea of Galilee. When you hear Jesus inviting you deeper and higher into his miracles, when you look out over the side of that boat into those deep black waters, what do you see? What's the limit, the ceiling that you've placed on Jesus' power in your own life? Maybe he could heal the sick. Maybe he could raise the dead, but he can't do this. He can't save me from this. When you see the rolling waves, when you feel the whipping wind on your face, what is it that tears your eyes away from Jesus? You might be walking in faith. What is it that makes you lose your focus? Maybe in the howling of the winds around you, you hear Satan's voice like I do all the time, reciting your past failures and sins, and it starts to drown out the voice of Jesus. Or maybe when you look at those rolling waves, you see your own addictions and fears and your own pride, and it starts to sweep you away. But here's a fact. If it's not him standing out on the water, if it's not him, you don't stand a chance. But if it's him, if it's the one who could save you from your sins and set you free, who's been faithful for years, who's worked an entire catalog of miracles in your life and the lives of the people around you, if it's him, then maybe you can take that step out of the boat. Maybe you can do something impossible. Maybe you can ask for help with what you've been hiding for so long. I know it feels impossible, but that's what God does. Maybe you can bring your secrets into the light so that they don't have power over you anymore. I know it feels impossible, but we worship a God who does things that are impossible. Maybe you can fix that relationship. Maybe you can change your habits. Maybe you can learn how to love yourself when you haven't done that in years. Maybe what I'm saying sounds impossible, and if it does, you've come to the right place. We just talked for the last 4 weeks here about a century of miracles that God has worked at the A&M Church of Christ. Just like when Jesus sent out the disciples in Matthew chapter 10, he sent them out to the villages. He said, go out there and heal the sick, drive out demons, raise the dead. In the same way, God has equipped this church. He's sent us out. He's delivered us from hard times. He's worked miracles in our lives. He's used this church to transform people, and I know that because I'm one of them. Throughout the last century, throughout those last 10 decades that we've been studying, how many Sundays do you think somebody came to the A&M Church of Christ and sat in the pews and wondered whether Jesus was going to come through for us on this one? We needed another miracle and they weren't sure. Well, we're here today because he always did. After a month of flipping through the catalog of miracles in the history of this church that Jesus has done, do you think he's going to quit on us tomorrow? Do you think he'll be here in the 101st year? In the 201st year? Do you think whatever problem you're facing or we're facing here, that's where he's met his match? Anything else he could do but that's impossible. If it's not him standing out there on the waters, we don't stand a chance. But if it's him, when we take the first step, we cannot fail. Peter spent time with Jesus. He studied him. He listened to him. He watched the way he treated people. And so in that moment, he said, if it's you, that gives me confidence to do anything. Do you study Jesus? Do you spend time with Jesus? Do you know him? Do you know the sound of his voice when you hear it? How he acts, how he treats people. That's what changed Peter's life. That's what gave him the confidence. If you're sitting out there thinking, I want those miracles in my life, I need a change, but I don't know if I can do it, that's what made a difference for Peter and for me and for you. It will. You get to know Jesus. You study him. You read about his life. You read stories like this, and you see him deliver over and over and over again, and how he never lets people down when they trust in him. And you'll start to realize that that is your story too. As we close here, let's talk quickly about the way this story ends. It's not easy to ignore the last part where Peter sinks. Let's not ignore the elephant in the room. Okay. Peter can't help but notice the winds and the waves. I think that's fair. He's standing out in the middle of water. There's waves, there's wind. He notices what's happening around him. He loses his focus, and he starts to sink. Now, Peter's gotten criticized for this a lot. You hear a lot of people talking about this passage, and they say, well, he never had enough faith to begin with. I don't think that's really fair, and I don't think that's the focus of the story. See, Peter stumbles when he takes his eyes and his ears off Jesus. I've done that too. I'm sure you know what that feels like. But Peter's failure isn't the most interesting part of the story. Anybody can fail. He does it all the time. We do it all the time. What's captivating here is how he acts when he falls. That fall, when he starts to sink into the water, of course he's scared, of course he panics, but it doesn't change his faith. It doesn't change his desire to be close to Jesus at all. And you know that because look what he says. As soon as he starts to sink, he doesn't say, well, I trusted Jesus on these first few steps. I'm starting to sink. I need back to the boat. Disciples, come get me. Somebody throw me a rope. Come around. He calls out to Jesus. He says, you've taken me these couple of steps. I took my eyes off. I know you can help me keep walking. He says, Lord, save me. That little step of faith, those steps he started to take, that already inspired continuing faith. And Jesus personally reaches out his hand and he catches Peter. He physically intervenes. He raises him up to save him. He rewards Peter's faith with more faith. And I love that the story kind of jumps. It says, when they got back in the boat, but think about that moment, what that must have been like. Jesus has got his hands on Peter. He lifts him back up on the water. And the two of them walk on the water back to the boat, and they get back in. They do it together. When you take a step of faith, he will never let you down, and he will reward you with more faith, with more trust, giving you more reasons to always trust in him. He doesn't let people down who put their faith in him. There will always be winds and waves in your life, but if it's him, you can take that step. He will catch you every time you fall. Let's pray. Jesus, we thank you for your patience with us when we continue to misunderstand and when we continue to doubt after everything you've done. I pray for everybody here and for myself that you give us the power to take whatever step of faith you're calling us to this morning. Whatever claims Satan's making on our lives or sins that we're hiding, I pray that you would help us to take that faithful step, to do something impossible, to put our trust not in ourselves or in the world, but in you. Thank you for never letting us down and for catching us when we fall. In Jesus' name, amen.